Well, let's finish with the Gospel according to John. John's Gospel has come under the most scrutiny of anyone else. What is the evidence for John writing John? In my estimation, very weighty evidence supports John's authorship. Ignatius in AD 110 in Turkey quotes John 3:8 in his letter to the Philadelphians. So he's citing this as early as AD 108 is presumably when this was written. The Moratorian fragment, remember we just studied that, dating to AD 170. It doesn't mention Matthew or Mark, but it says that the fourth gospel is that of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, one of the disciples. Irenaeus, writing in France in AD 180, John, the disciple of the Lord. Well, maybe a generic disciple? No, the one who had leaned upon Jesus' breast had himself published a gospel during his residence in Ephesus in Asia. Tertullian, AD 210, we lay it down as our first position that the Evangelical Testament has apostles for its authors. Of the apostles, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, while of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterward. Let me just be a broken record. They weren't squeamish that Luke and Mark didn't live or see Jesus on earth, but they call them apostolic men. They said, yeah, they didn't see Jesus as eyewitnesses, but who did? Matthew and John. They were the eyewitnesses, the disciples of Jesus. Clement of Alexandria, AD 215. John, at last, took to writing for the following cause. The three Gospels, which had been written down before, were distributed to all, including himself. It is said he welcomed them and testified to their truth, but he said that there was only lacking to the narrative the account of what was done by Christ at the first and the beginning of the preaching. If you've ever compared John with the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see that John includes this whole part at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, where it includes a ministry in the region of Judea. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, just jump right into his ministry in Galilee. So John said, wait, hold on a second. What about the ministry in Judea? So he includes that. So this was one of the reasons for which he wrote his gospel, because these miracles weren't included in the synoptic Gospels. So John, as an eyewitness, someone that was deeply close with Christ, felt the need to write this himself. Well, Clement continues. He says, they say accordingly that John was asked to relate in his own gospel the period that passed over in the silence by the former evangelists. Eusebius writes that the gospel was written by John, the companion of Peter, James, and the other apostles. Peter, James, and John, the three closest disciples to Jesus. They're at the Mount of Transfiguration. They go on retreats with Jesus. That's the John that is being referred to here, John of Zebedee. Again, wide geographical distribution all over the Roman Empire, and all of them agreeing that John was the one who wrote this gospel, or citing this gospel, at the very least, in the case of Ignatius. Well, that being said, we should look at the internal evidence as well. What is the internal evidence within the gospel? Well, the gospel was written by an apostle. In John 13:23, it says that the disciple whom Jesus loved was at the Last Supper. Remember that tender scene where he's laying on the chest of Jesus? So he's there at the Last Supper. But Mark 14 says that it was only the 12 who were there at the Last Supper. So whoever wrote the Gospel of John must have been one of the 12. So too, this figure was well known in the early church. Well, how do you know that? Well, we read at the end of the Gospel, John 21:21, remember Jesus tells Peter how he's going to die, presumably by crucifixion. You'll have to stretch out your hands and go to a place that you don't want to go. And Peter, rambunctious Peter, you're telling me I'm going to die by crucifixion? Well, what about him? What about him, Lord? Pointing to the disciple Jesus loved. And Jesus replied, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, you follow me. And consequently, we read, "So the rumor spread among the community of believers that this disciple wouldn't die." What does that imply? Rumors only are spread about people who are important. People like apostles. He explicitly comes out and says that he's not just well known, but that he was an eyewitness of these events. The author is the beloved disciple. That much is clear. And we read at the end of the gospel, chapter 21, verse 24, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things." He wrote this, and he's the author, or he is the beloved disciple, the one that was in the upper room, the one at the Last Supper. John 1:14, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory." He is an eyewitness. John 19 at the crucifixion, verse 35, "He who has seen these things has testified, and his testimony is true." Repeatedly in this gospel, the author is claiming to be an eyewitness. And we can piece together that this eyewitness, this author, the beloved disciple, they're one and the same. He's also an apostle, and he's also very well known in the early Christian community. Furthermore, whenever we read about the beloved disciple being in the place described in the Gospel according to John, whenever he's there, whenever he's present in that place, the historical detail shoots through the roof. So we read, for example, in John 1:39, when the beloved disciple is there with Jesus, that it's the 10th hour. That's really specific. Why would you know the time of day? Because he was there. That's why. When we get to the Last Supper and the beloved disciple is laying on Jesus' when he's laying on Jesus' breast, the beloved disciple is laying on Jesus' breast at the Last Supper, and he points out the fact that Judas was handed the morsel and dipped it in the wine for the Passover meal. What does that imply? That's something he's saying, I was there. I saw it. That's not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. That's an eyewitness detail. When we get to the crucifixion, we see that John is the only one who says that Jesus' knees weren't broken. The practice called curifragium. They would break the knees, the person would suffocate and die. John is the only one who mentions that. So too, John is the only one that mentions that when Jesus was punctured in the rib, that blood and water flowed out of his lung. The pericardium, that sac around the heart, burst, and blood and water poured out. That is an eyewitness detail. The other Gospels don't mention that. But the beloved disciple was there. Remember, Jesus said to his mother, "Behold your son." And he said to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother." John was there at the crucifixion, and the historical data shoot through the roof. So too, when we see Jesus' return, John says that he made us breakfast. Who mentions that except for an eyewitness? He even says that they pulled in that big catch of fish. Remember in John 21? How many fish? 153. That is so specific. Why do you include those kind of details? Well, you include them if you were there. You include them if you came from a profession of being a fisherman. He even says they were the big ones too, the big fish, large fish, 153. That sounds like something a fisherman would say.